Dow Meeting Archives, September 13th, 2015. Meddle by Bill Bunting.
Everyone, please follow me. 起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬、一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加固定姿势一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated.
The last few weeks, I've gone over some maybe social issues that from time to time seem to rear their ugly heads, even when we're in the process of cultivating the Tao teachings. And this is yet another one of these. Interestingly enough, the one-word title pretty much says it all. Meddling. It is human nature to want to be involved in everybody else's business but our own. It just is. It's something that I see everywhere. It happens no matter where you are, who you're with, what the group of people you're with are. It's so doggone pandemic that it would be difficult to argue that it's not a natural part of human nature. But its impact and consequences are such that Lao Tzu warns us against it over and over and over again in the Tao Te Ching. So what do we talk about when we're talking about meddling? Very frequently, meddling comes from a self-righteous, we believe we're taking care of somebody else's best and highest good by telling them what they should or shouldn't do perspective. We're minding other people's business instead of minding our own. It starts with gossip and works its way around to solicited and unsolicited advice, the things that we feel compelled to push on other people because we know that our wisdom and insight goes far beyond the mortal man. And we feed that need to be right, to be correct, to impose our will on others, perhaps, as we pay attention to what their business is and not what our own is. I've been victimized by my own human nature, my own need to advise and prod people to go where I thought they should have gone. And every time I've ever done that, the outcome's been catastrophic. And on the back end of those situations, I've always wondered why. But I think the better question that we can ask of ourselves is, why in the devil do we feel the need to run someone else's life? Why do we need to be in the middle of someone else's affairs? What is it we're hoping to achieve by doing that? Are we looking for a measure of control over the other person? Are we trying to minimize and deflect our own insecurities, our own confidence issues, our own problems? Are we embroiled in enough conflict and controversy of our own that it's easier for us to look at somebody else's than it is for us to fix our own lives? Sometimes I think perhaps. And we always do it in the name of looking out for the other person. We never call it what it is. Butting in, applying leverage, trying to get somebody to do what you want them to do. Nobody ever says that. We're always trying to help the other person out. We're trying to help them see the bigger picture. We want them to be reasonable and do it our way. That almost never works. And it never engenders feelings of goodwill and happiness amongst people. Normally it engenders feelings of being manipulated and used, and that tends to make people upset. I've taken two parts out of chapter 64 of the Tao Te Ching, where Lao Tzu specifically speaks to this. He says, the one who meddles will fail. The one who grasps will lose. Therefore, sages do not meddle, and thus do not fail. They do not grasp, and thus do not lose. Therefore, the sages desire not to desire. They do not value goods that are hard to acquire. They learn to unlearn, to redeem the fault of the people, to assist the nature of all things, without daring to meddle. It just can't get too much more clear than these couple of paragraphs. And yet, if I were to ask everybody here what meddling is, for every person that's here, I'd probably get a different answer. There'd be some commonalities, to be sure. But everybody sees that as a somewhat different set of behaviors, a somewhat different way of approaching things. And normally what we do is rationalize that behavior behind what we think's best for another person. If the other person is one of our children, that's an obligation we have. As parents, we are specifically required to meddle in the affairs of our children so that they grow up with a set of values that will propel them forward in life, and an education that'll let them do something with the values that we've hopefully instilled in them. But as they get older, they become subject to the same cautions about meddling that everybody else is. It is not appropriate to meddle in the affairs of our adult children either. Sometimes a person will ask us what we think they should do, and we consider that to be an invitation to meddle. But the reality of that situation is that whether we impose ourselves in the middle of the situation by our own will or somebody invites us in, we never have enough information to properly advise another person. When somebody invites us to meddle, chances are, at best, we only hear one half of the story. And at the worst, we may not hear that. We always get the perspective of the individual who's talking. And none of us is clairvoyant enough, psychic enough, or gifted enough to know what all of the rest of the information is. We cannot ever know all there is to know about another person's situation, or their activities, or their beliefs, or their goals, or their motivations, to understand how to properly guide them in very many cases. And the presumption that we are that wise, that gifted, that knowledgeable is nearly always flawed. We're not. And not having enough information to understand the entire situation makes any advice that we try to hand out to another person intrinsically flawed. It's like baking loaves of bread in a bread pan that has a dent in it. You know, you can still bake the bread, but every loaf that comes out of it's going to have the same dent. If we don't know all of the information there is to know, that flaw exists and will continue to exist. And yet, by and large, we ignore that and go right on ahead to give our best well-meaning advice to any old body who asks for it, and sometimes to those who don't. When we do that, we have instantaneously put ourselves in a situation where, whether the outcome is positive or not, usually it isn't, whatever happens, we're wrong. Win, lose, or draw, we're wrong. No matter what the outcome is, sooner or later, we're wrong. And then, because we had the unmitigated gall to hand out solicited or unsolicited advice to another person, the outcome becomes our fault. When we presume to take away choice or to apply leverage to another person, then we become the scapegoat for all of the decisions that are made based on that leveraging. Convenient, huh? It's no wonder Lao Tzu was scared to death to meddle and admonishes us so many times not to. Lao Tzu's words in the previous slide, the one who meddles will fail, the one who grasps will lose, have a lot of weight and meaning to them. A meddling personality is a personality that seeks at some level to control, to exert influence over the hearts and minds of others, instead of providing choice or options and allowing the other person to decide what's right for them to do or not. It indicates a mindset not of humility and compassion, but of an agenda and perhaps unclear motivations. And that mindset is inherently self-destructive. As we seek to exert our influence over others, very often we fail to pay attention to the things in our own lives that require remediation and refinement. It is always infinitely easier to see the flaw in another person than it is to see the flaw in ourselves. It is so much simpler to tell somebody else what they need to do to get right than it is for us to look in the mirror and tell ourselves that same thing. It is a fundamental illusion of the ego self that we see ourselves as flawless and perfect, or as close to it as can be gotten in this lifetime, and everybody else as being painfully in need of our advice in order to get through their day. Nothing could be further from the truth. Lao Tzu says that the sages do not meddle and thus do not fail. Understand that from the mindset of exerting control and undue influence and mucking around in the affairs of others, we set ourselves up in a scenario where everything that we attempt to do is going to end badly. There's not the appropriate level of forethought and planning and execution required for those things to end any other way, because we are dividing our attention between what we should be doing and what we should not be doing. Lao Tzu says that the sage does not grasp and thus does not lose. It's an interesting and recurring theme in the Tao Te Ching, that one who would hold on to and control pretty much anything ultimately will have that control wrested away from them and will not be able to hang on and control what they were hoping to grasp and control. Whether it's the world, the self, the metaphor for the self, the emperor, the sovereign, whether it's another person, doesn't make any difference, because it's the attitude, it's the mindset that dooms us from the get-go, and the reason for the caution. Lao Tzu goes on to say that the sages then desire not to desire. And this is a powerful phrase here, because most of the time when we're meddling in somebody else's business, that meddling is based on a desire or an attachment. It's an agenda that we're pushing, even if it's subconscious, that the other person may not share, and in fact probably does not share. Even when they've asked us to meddle, even when they've asked us what they should do. The best thing we can do at that point, like I said, is maybe describe some options and leave the choices open. I've found that the best way around this for me is simply to tell folks I really can't advise you on this particular topic. You know, there are things, for instance, martial training and those sorts of things, where I can present people with a number of options in a variety of scenarios because I've got countless years of training and experience. But that's a fairly narrow and relatively close community, and it takes an awful lot of life out of the equation when we start talking about martial training. When somebody's asking about how they should handle an issue with a relative, a family member, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, something else like that, the one who dares to advise is on thin ice and shaky ground from the beginning. And it's not that I haven't done that before. I absolutely have. What I'm telling you is that the times where I've done that, where I've allowed myself to slip into that, I have always regretted it later. So the sages desire not to desire. They don't want an agenda attached to what they say and what they do. They refuse. They don't value goods that are hard to acquire. They're not seeking with an agenda to get some kind of leverage or influence over somebody else that enhances their profitability in some way. They're looking out for the other person by simply not influence over them. They learn to unlearn, to get rid of the ego-based behaviors and emotions that drive us to the things that we really shouldn't do if we want to stay mentally and emotionally healthy and on the center path. To redeem the fault of the people. This line has always given me some trouble in this verse because I'm not really sure what Lao Tzu saw in his mind when he wrote it. The picture that it draws in my mind is the picture of an example of non-contention, of not exerting influence over others, of not meddling in the affairs of others, and allowing people to live without that agenda hanging over them, without the desires and attachments motivating them. To assist the nature of all things without daring to meddle. If there were ever wise words written, those are they. And in fact, being involved in everybody else's business is something that is so widespread, so prevalent, that we could talk about this every other week for the next year, and it would still bear repeating. It's an insidious, ugly little trap of the ego self. Because the ego self tells us what we're doing is looking out for the other person. When in point of fact, what we're really doing is attempting to push our agenda on them. It requires some forethought and some caution and an attitude of strongly desiring not to do that, to prevent it. It requires resisting the knee-jerk reaction to insert ourselves squarely into the middle of a question asked or somebody else's personal business. And we can see it every day. Around the water coolers, in the hallways, at school, on the street, wherever. Even between neighbors and people who live in the same neighborhood. There's always somebody who's the butt of the gossip, the butt of the advice, the object of the manipulation. And those who are way too eager to spread the gossip and the rumors and participate in the process of unhinging that person's life. No matter what we tell ourselves, meddling in another person's affairs is not the same as compassionate assistance. It isn't. It never is. Compassion does not seek to control or persuade another person to do or be something they are not, or to do something that's not within their inherent capacity to do. It doesn't violate somebody's concepts of right and wrong or good and evil. Real help for another person does not come with strings and attachments. It doesn't come with conditions. It doesn't come with leverage. And acting with humility does not have an agenda. It seeks only the highest good of everybody concerned. And so, to me, over the years, I've distilled this down into this single sentence that using the Tao means not daring to meddle no matter what. And while we can say that with a certain amount of ease, putting it into practice can be just a whole bunch more difficult. And yet, as we read the Tao Te Ching, it's very clear that Lao Tzu discourages meddling very strongly. And I've come to find that any time the teachings repeat something more than 3 or 4 times, that concept is probably pretty doggone important. So why does Lao Tzu discourage it so strongly? Well, because meddling creates conflict, it creates tension, it creates problems between people. It's not an act of unification and harmony. It's an action of splitting people apart, of separation, of contention. It's not within our purview to control another person, and we really shouldn't even try. Because when we try to persuade or change another person's choices, we're instantly at odds with that person. We put ourselves head to head and toe to toe into some kind of contention, even if we didn't mean to. Why? Because meddling almost always has some kind of agenda, some kind of leverage behind it, some kind of persuasive force behind it. And in the same breath, it's also always a boomerang. Whatever we set about to do to another person, sooner or later is going to come back around and hit us full in the face. And I have quite enough difficulties in my life without inviting any new ones in, if I can help it. That kind of helps me to temper my thinking and keep my mouth shut. So to kind of wrap it up today, anytime that we prepare to exert our influence over another person, perhaps we ought to stop and examine our own motives. It's beneficial, very beneficial for us to remember that Lao Tzu cautioned us not to dare to meddle. It's one of the keys to a long and happy life. Close the door, shut the mouth, live without toil all through life. Meddle in the affairs, live without salvation all through life. Perhaps sometimes, like kind of what I've done, asking if we really need more conflict and problems in our lives will remind us of the natural outcome of meddling around in other people's affairs. This is one of those things where the ego can get a grip on us in a big way, and it's insidious enough that until we pay it direct attention, we may not realize it's even there. Because resisting human nature is tough. But then again, that's why we cultivate the Tao teachings to begin with, is to learn to refine and improve what we started with, and to try to lose some of the bad habits, some of the ego-driven, self-destructive behaviors that we all get stuck in the middle of, so that perhaps day by day we can get a little bit closer to walking that center path to enlightenment. Thank you all very much for letting me share with you. I do always enjoy talking to you. Have a wonderful Sunday.
So one question is, what about a really tough situation, a difficult situation, where perhaps a family member has an issue with substance abuse, alcohol addiction, a troubling issue like that. How should one be able to handle that from the Tao perspective?
With compassion and gentility, but you got to realize at some point and at some level that despite what you want for your relative, whoever it is, they're going to make their own choices. They're going to do their own thing. And if you try to leverage them too much, the only thing you're going to do is eat yourself alive. I actually have a relative in that very situation. She's alcoholic. And I'm telling you, you can tear yourself up trying to influence that situation. At some point, you have to trust both in that person's desire, hopefully, to get help and to get sober, and support them in that, but not let yourself get dragged down into the arguments and the cajoling and the pushing and the interfering, because it just doesn't work, and it'll suck the life out of you.
That's right. It drains your energy, I think. What I have observed, when I observe ordained masters, when they help people out, especially people who have very serious life issues, what I have seen is that they're able to approach these people that are in such dire straits with a combination with they're gentle, but they're firm. So they have a firm hand. They're very gentle about providing assistance and advice, and yet they have this unyielding principle of the Tao that they won't compromise on. I think it's a tricky balancing act for most people who perhaps haven't seen that a whole bunch in life, but gentle firmness comes to mind as what the masters do.
Yeah, that's an excellent description of that. Not compromising yourself to try to help somebody else.
Exactly. So Bill, what about tough love? And that reminds me of a conversation that I had with Phoebe. She was wondering the same question. What about tough love? When you're dealing with a family member and just nothing else works, what do you do?
Well, okay, in my situation, I still have kids at home. Samantha's only 12, I have to protect them. I have to protect the peace and harmony in my home. And I refuse to let somebody wander in here and turn the whole place upside down. And so my explanation is if you want to come here, I'll be happy to help you if that's what you want. But to the extent that you try to upset my home, you can't be here.
Right. That's similar to a mindset that I noticed in masters and sages, in that they don't actively go out to volunteer, quote unquote, volunteer to help someone. That's more like interference. They wait until someone calls on them and say, "Master, please help me," and then they take action, because the feeling is that when someone is actually asking for help, they're ready to receive something. Prior to that, you can try so hard only to meet up against really tough resistance, someone who's closed-minded, who won't hear anything that you have to say, and then all that effort is going nowhere.
Yeah, it's draining. It'll run you into the dirt.
Let's do the meeting ending ritual. 起立，面向佛堂，持下三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持下各位点传是一鞠躬，结班一鞠躬。That's it. We are done, everybody.
Join the Tao meeting live to participate in the questions and commentary. For more information, go to http://taoism.net/tao/ connect-online.